The morning sun cast long shadows across the small cemetery as Margaret Henderson stood beside the freshly dug grave. Her black dress, borrowed from her neighbor, hung loose on her thin frame. She had lost so much weight during her husband's illness that nothing fit properly anymore. Beside her, 8-year-old Lucy clutched her mother's hand with both of hers, her small fingers cold despite the warm Wyoming sun. The preacher's words seemed to drift away on the wind as Margaret stared at the simple wooden cross that marked where Thomas lay. 3 months of watching him waste away from the fever, 3 months of sleepless nights and doctor bills they couldn't afford, and now this. The finality of dirt hitting wood echoed in her chest like a hollow drum. Around them, the good people of Millbrook shifted uncomfortably in their Sunday clothes. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while her husband removed his hat and held it against his chest. The blacksmith, old Henry, nodded respectfully when Margaret's eyes met his. These were decent folks, but Margaret could feel their worried glances. Everyone knew what happened to widows in frontier towns like this. Thomas had been the heart of their little family and the backbone of their small ranch. He'd worked the general store during the day and tended their cattle in the evenings, always with a smile and a kind word for everyone. Now the store sat empty, and their dozen head of cattle wandered the pasture without purpose. Much like Margaret felt herself as the last prayer was spoken and neighbors began to drift away. Margaret felt the weight of reality settling on her shoulders like a heavy winter coat. Lucy tugged at her skirt, looking up with those bright blue eyes that mirrored her father's. "Mama, when are we going home?" Lucy whispered. Margaret's throat tightened. Home. The little house with the blue shutters that Thomas had painted just last spring. The kitchen where she'd cooked his favorite meals, trying to tempt his appetite when the sickness took hold. The bedroom where she'd held his hand through those final, difficult nights. "Soon, sweetheart," she managed to say, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. But even as she spoke, Margaret knew that home might not be theirs much longer. The banknote on the ranch was due in 6 weeks, and without Thomas's income, she had no way to pay it. The doctor bills from his illness had eaten through their small savings like fire through drygrass. Mayor Edmund Blackwood approached them as the crowd thinned. He was a large man with a round belly that strained against his vest buttons, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Behind him walked his son Robert, a thin young man who worked as a clerk at the bank. "Mrs. Henderson," the mayor said, removing his hat with what seemed like practiced sympathy. "Such a tragedy. Thomas was a good man, a pillar of our community." "Thank you, Mayor Blackwood," Margaret replied, instinctively pulling Lucy closer to her side. "I wonder if we might have a word," he continued, glancing meaningfully at the other mourners still within earshot. "Perhaps tomorrow evening? I believe there are matters we should discuss regarding your situation." The way he said situation made Margaret's skin crawl, but she nodded politely. In a town like Millbrook, you didn't ignore the mayor's requests. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Thomas's sister Clara, sorting through a stack of bills and papers. The numbers seemed to swim before her tired eyes, but the message was clear. The ranch mortgage, the doctor bills, the money owed to the general store's suppliers, it all added up to more than she could ever hope to pay. You could sell the cattle, Clara suggested, though her tone suggested she knew it wouldn't be enough. "Even if I got good prices, it would barely cover half of what we owe," Margaret replied, setting down her pencil with a sigh. "And then what? I'd have no income at all." Clara reached across the table and took her sister-in-law's hand. "Margaret, you know what the mayor wants to discuss tomorrow." Margaret did know, though she'd been trying not to think about it. Edmund Blackwood had been a widower for 2 years now, and she'd noticed his lingering glances even before Thomas got sick. The whole town had noticed. "His first wife died trying to give him a son," Clara continued gently. "Everyone knows he's been looking for someone to take her place." "I buried my husband this morning," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can anyone expect me to even think about ... "Because you have Lucy to think about," Clara interrupted, though not unkindly. "And because Mayor Blackwood owns the bank. He owns half the businesses in town. If he wanted to help you, he could make your problems disappear, but if he doesn't..." She didn't need to finish. Margaret understood the reality of their situation perfectly. In 1887, a widow woman had few options, especially one with a child to support. She could try to find work, but what jobs were available to women paid barely enough to keep body and soul together. She could try to run the ranch alone, but without the knowledge or physical strength to manage the cattle and land, she'd likely fail within a year. The worst possibility hung unspoken between them, the orphanage in Cheyenne City. If Margaret couldn't support Lucy, the authorities might decide the child would be better off in an institution. The thought made Margaret's stomach turn. Later that night, after Clara had gone home and Lucy was asleep, Margaret walked through the small house that had been her world for the past 6 years. In the parlor, Thomas's chair still held the impression of his body. His coat hung on the peg by the door, and his coffee cup sat unwashed beside the sink dot. She picked up the cup and held it to her chest, breathing in the faint scent of coffee. And the soap he'd used. For a moment, she could almost pretend he was just outside checking on the animals, that he'd walk through the door any minute with dirt on his boots and love in his eyes. But the empty house echoed with silence and reality. Crashed back over her like a cold wave. Margaret had been 17 when she married Thomas, full of dreams about their life together. He'd been 25, already established with his store and his small ranch, and he'd courted her with the patience and gentleness that marked all his dealings. Their wedding day had been the happiest of her life, and the birth of Lucy 3 years later had completed their little family. Now, at 32, she felt ancient. The past months of nursing Thomas through his illness had carved lines around her eyes and streaked her brown hair with premature gray. Her hands, once soft and white, were now rough from washing clothes and scrubbing floors to save money. They couldn't afford to spend on help. She walked to Lucy's bedroom door and peeked inside. Her daughter slept peacefully, her small face relaxed. In sleep, one arm curled around the rag doll Thomas had bought her last Christmas. Lucy had been so brave during her father's illness, never complaining when Margaret couldn't read to her or when dinner was late because she was caring for Thomas. The child deserved better than uncertainty and fear. She deserved a secure home, good food, and the chance to grow up safe and loved. If marrying Mayor Blackwood was the only way to provide those things, then perhaps Margaret would have to swallow her feelings and do what was necessary, but the thought of Edmund Blackwood's hands on her, of sharing a bed with him, of pretending to be a loving wife when her heart was buried in the cemetery with Thomas, made her feel sick. She'd heard whispers about his first wife, about how demanding he could be, how he expected absolute obedience from everyone around him. Margaret returned to the kitchen and lit a candle, then sat down to write a letter to her sister in Denver. Maybe there was another way. Maybe she could take Lucy and start over somewhere else, find work as a seamstress or a cook. But even as she wrote, she knew it was a desperate fantasy. She had no money for train fare, no contacts in Denver, and no guarantee of finding work that would support them both. The candle burned low as Margaret stared at the unfinished letter, tears blurring her vision. Tomorrow Mayor Blackwood would come calling, and she would have to listen to his proposal. She would have to smile and nod and pretend to be grateful for his attention. Even though every fiber of her being recoiled from the idea, outside the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and reminding her of all the repairs the house needed. Winter was coming, and without Thomas's steady income, she couldn't afford to heat the house properly. Lucy would need warm clothes, food, medicine if she got sick. Margaret blew out the candle and made her way to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her chest. Tomorrow would bring Mayor Blackwood's visit, and with it, the conversation that would determine the rest of her life. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Margaret pulled the covers over her head, wishing she could hide from the world forever. But morning would come, as it always did, and she would have to face whatever lay ahead. For Lucy's sake, she would have to be strong, even when she felt like the weakest person in the world. The next evening arrived far too quickly for Margaret's liking. She had spent the entire day cleaning the house, not because it needed it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Lucy helped by dusting the lower shelves and organizing. her small collection of books, sensing her mother's nervousness even if she didn't understand the reason. At exactly 6 o'clock, the sound of horse hooves on the dirt road announced Mayor Blackwood's arrival. Margaret smoothed her dark blue dress, the nicest one she owned that wasn't her funeral black, and took a deep breath. Through the window, she watched him step down from his polished buggy, straightening his jacket and checking his pocket watch. With the precision of a man who valued punctuality above all else, he knocked 3 times, each rap deliberate and commanding. Margaret opened the door to find him holding an enormous bouquet of store-bought roses, their petals perfect and artificial-looking compared to the wildflowers Thomas used to bring her from the meadow. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice smooth as butter, "you look lovely this evening." Margaret forced a smile. "Thank you, Mayor Blackwood." "Please come in." He stepped into her modest parlor, his eyes taking in every detail. She could almost see him cataloging the worn furniture, the faded curtains, the small tears in the carpet that she'd tried to hide with careful placement of chairs. His gaze lingered on the daguerreotype of Thomas on the mantelpiece, and something flickered across his face that might have been satisfaction. "Where's the little one?" he asked, settling his bulk into Thomas's chair without invitation. "Lucy is having supper with her Aunt Clara," Margaret replied, grateful she'd thought to send her daughter away for the evening. "She be staying the night." "Ah, very wise." Adult conversations are best conducted without little ears present. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, preparing coffee and slicing the apple pie she'd baked that morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged everything on her best china, the set Thomas had given her for their first wedding anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using dishes meant to celebrate love to serve a man who threatened. Everything she held dear, when she returned to the parlor, Mayor Blackwood had made himself completely at home. He'd lit his pipe and was studying the family Bible on the side table, though Margaret doubted his interest was spiritual. "This is a fine home," he said, accepting his coffee cup. "Small, of course, but adequate. With some improvements it could be quite comfortable." Margaret sat across from him, her own cup growing cold in her hands. "Thomas always said it was perfect for our family." "Thomas was a good man," Blackwood replied, though his tone suggested he considered this more of a weakness than a virtue. Perhaps too good for his own welfare. A man needs to be practical in this world, especially when it comes to business matters. The criticism of her late husband made Margaret's jaw tighten, but she held her tongue. She couldn't afford to anger the mayor, not when he held her future in his hands. "I trust you've had time to consider your situation," he continued, cutting into his pie with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. "I've taken the liberty of reviewing your financial obligations." Margaret's cheeks burned. "You had no right to—" "I had every right," he interrupted, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "As mayor, I have a responsibility to know about the financial stability of our citizens. And as a friend of the family, I have a concern for your welfare." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather folder, spreading papers across the coffee table with the efficiency of a man conducting business. Margaret recognized the documents immediately, her mortgage papers, Thomas's medical bills, the invoices from the general store. "Let's review the facts," Blackwood said, putting on his spectacles. "You owe the bank $437 on the ranch mortgage. The doctor's bills total $192. Your suppliers are owed another $85. That's a total of $714, due in full within 6 weeks. Each number hit Margaret like a physical blow. Hearing them read aloud made them seem even more impossible than when she'd calculated them herself. "Your cattle, even at the best prices, might bring $200, he continued relentlessly. "Your household goods, perhaps 50 more. That leaves you over $400 short, with no income to cover basic living expenses." Margaret stared at the papers, the numbers blurring together. "I could find work," she said weakly. Blackwood chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Doing what?" "Mrs. Peterson has a girl to help with washing. The hotel has all the cleaning help it needs. Even if you found something, women's work pays perhaps $3 a week." At that rate, it would take you years to pay off these debts, assuming you could somehow manage to feed and clothe yourself and Lucy on nothing. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the patience of a cat watching a cornered mouse. There is, however, another solution. A partnership that would benefit us both. Margaret's stomach churned, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. What kind of partnership? Marriage, he said simply. You need security and protection. I need a wife to manage my household and help me maintain my position in the community. It's a practical arrangement that solves both our problems. The word marriage hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Margaret had known this moment was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. I would, of course, pay off all your debts immediately, Blackwood continued, as if he were discussing a business transaction. Lucy would be provided for, educated properly, and given opportunities she could never have otherwise. You would have a secure home, fine clothes, and the respect that comes with being the mayor's wife. Margaret's throat felt dry as dust, and in return, his smile was cold and calculating. In return, you would be my wife in every sense of the word. You would manage my household, entertain my guests, and support my political ambitions. You would be loyal, obedient, and grateful for the security I provide. The way he said obedient made Margaret's skin crawl. She thought of Thomas, who had never demanded anything of her except her love, who had treated her as an equal partner in their marriage. I've only been widowed for 2 days, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grief is a luxury you cannot afford, Blackwood replied matter-of-factly. In 6 weeks, the bank will foreclose on this property. You'll be homeless with a child to support and no means to do so. The county will have no choice but to place Lucy in the orphanage. The threat was delivered with casual cruelty, but Margaret could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He enjoyed having power over her, enjoyed watching her struggle with an impossible choice. I've heard the conditions at the Cheyenne orphanage are quite harsh, he continued. Children are worked like servants, given minimal food and education. Many don't survive to adulthood. Lucy is such a bright, pretty child. It would be a shame to see her waste away in such a place. Margaret's hands clenched into fists in her lap. You're threatening my daughter? I'm stating facts, Blackwood said calmly. The choice is yours, of course. But I think any reasonable person would see the wisdom in my proposal. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the ranch that had been her home for 6 years. This is good land, he mused. With proper management, it could be quite profitable. I've been considering expanding my holdings in this direction. The implication was clear. Whether she agreed to marry him or not, he intended to acquire her property. The only question was whether she would be his wife or his victim. I need time to think, Margaret said, though they both knew she was simply delaying the inevitable. Of course, Blackwood replied, checking his pocket watch, but not too much time. I'm a patient man, but I'm also a busy one. I have responsibilities to consider. He gathered his papers and tucked them back into his folder with practiced efficiency. I'll expect your answer by Sunday. That gives you 4 days to make peace with your situation. As he moved toward the door, he paused beside Thomas's chair, running his hand along the worn armrest. I think I'll have this reupholstered, he said casually. Something in leather, perhaps. More suitable for a man of my position. The casual dismissal of Thomas's memory was like a slap in the face. Margaret bit her tongue to keep from screaming at him to leave, to never touch anything that had belonged to her husband. Good evening, Mrs. Henderson, Blackwood said, tipping his hat. I trust you'll make the right decision. For Lucy's sake, if not your own. After he left, Margaret sank into her chair and buried her face in her hands. The house felt contaminated by his presence, as if his very being had poisoned air. She could still smell his cologne, still hear his cold, calculating voice discussing her future as, if she were a piece of property to be acquired, the roses he'd brought lay forgotten on the table, their cloying scent making her nauseous. She gathered them up and threw them into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the perfect petals. If only she could burn away the memory of this evening as easily, outside, Night fell over the ranch, but Margaret couldn't bring herself to light the lamps. She sat in the darkness, thinking about Thomas, about Lucy, about the impossible choice she faced. 4 days to decide. Thursday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of endless blue sky that made the Wyoming Territory feel like the edge of the world. Margaret was hanging laundry behind her house when she first saw the dust cloud on the eastern horizon. Living on the frontier had taught her to notice such things. Riders approaching could mean news, trouble, or opportunity, and it was best to know which one was heading your way. The lone figure emerged from the heat shimmer like something from a dream. He sat straight in his saddle, moving with the easy rhythm of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. Even from a distance, Margaret could see he was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered look that came from years under the open sky. Lucy pressed her face against the kitchen window, watching with the curiosity of a child who rarely saw strangers. "Mama, who's that man?" Margaret shaded her eyes with her hand, studying the approaching rider. "I don't know, sweetheart." "Stay inside until we know what he wants." The stranger rode into Millbrook like he owned the place, but without the arrogance that usually came with such confidence. He dismounted at Pete's livery stable with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. Margaret noticed how his hand rested naturally near the gun on his hip, not threatening, but ready. Jake Morrison had been riding for 3 days straight, and Millbrook looked like the kind of place where a man could rest his horse and maybe find a decent meal. He'd learned to read towns quickly during his years as a lawman, and something about this one felt different. The people moved with careful steps, their conversations stopping when strangers drew near. At the livery, old Pete took Jake's horse with practiced hands. "She's a fine animal," Pete said, running his fingers along the mare's neck. "Quarter horse?" "Part Mustang," Jake replied, loosening his saddlebags. "She's got spirit, but she's steady when it counts." Pete nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of horse a man needs out here. You planning to stay long?" "Just passing through," Jake said, though he found himself curious about the tension he sensed in the air. "Quiet town." "Quiet enough," Pete agreed, but his tone suggested there was more to the story. "The hotel's decent. If you're looking for a room, Mrs. Wilson runs it, makes good coffee." Jake paid for his horse's care and shouldered his bags. The main street of Millbrook was typical of frontier towns: a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other businesses clustered around the dusty road. But there was something in the way people watched him, a wariness that went beyond normal caution around strangers. The Silver Dollar Saloon was dim and cool after the bright sunshine. Jake ordered whiskey and took a seat at the bar, letting his eyes adjust to the low light. The bartender, a stocky man with graying hair, served him with the efficiency of someone who'd been pouring drinks for years. "Haven't seen you before," the bartender said, wiping down glasses with mechanical precision. "Name's Jake Morrison," he replied, taking a sip of the whiskey. It was better than he'd expected. "Just riding through." "Pete Barnes," the bartender replied. "I run this place." "You're welcome to it, long as you don't cause trouble," Jake nodded. He'd learned that bartenders often knew more about a town than the mayor or sheriff. "Seems like a peaceful place." Pete's laugh was short and bitter. Peaceful, maybe, but not always fair. Before Jake could ask what he meant, 2 men entered the saloon. They wore the clothes of ranch hands, but their conversation immediately caught Jake's attention. "I still say it ain't right," the younger man was saying. "That woman's got enough troubles without Blackwood making it worse." "Keep your voice down, Charlie," his companion warned. "You know how the mayor feels about people discussing his business." "His business?" Charlie's voice rose despite the warning. "Forcing a widow to marry him ain't business. It's plain wrong." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard this story before in different towns with different names, but the pattern was always the same. Powerful men using their position to prey on those who couldn't fight back. Pete continued cleaning glasses, but Jake could see the tension in his shoulders. "You boys want the usual?" "Just beer?" the older man said, shooting a warning look at his young companion. "And maybe we should talk about something else." But Charlie was young and angry, and alcohol made him bold. "Why should?" Everyone knows what's happening. Poor Mrs. Henderson lost her husband, and now she's got to choose between marrying that snake or losing everything. That snake runs this town, Pete warned quietly. And he's got a long memory for people who cross him. Jake finished his whiskey and stood. This Mrs. Henderson, he said casually. She's the widow you're talking about? Charlie looked up, surprised to find the stranger listening. Yeah, Margaret Henderson. Her husband died a few days ago, and now Mayor Blackwood's got her backed into a corner. She's got debts she can't pay and a little girl to worry about. Charlie, the older man hissed. Shut up. But Jake was already walking away, his mind churning with familiar anger. He'd seen too many corrupt officials abuse their power, too many. Good people crushed by those who were supposed to protect them. The memory of why he'd left Texas burned in his chest like acid. The next morning, Jake found himself at the general store, ostensibly looking for supplies, but really trying to learn more about the situation. The store was small but well organized, with everything from flour and sugar to farming tools and ammunition. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 30s, with brown hair pulled back in a simple style and eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. Margaret looked up as the stranger entered, automatically straightening her shoulders. She'd been running the store since Thomas got sick, trying to keep the business going, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. Everything reminded her of her husband, the way he'd arranged the shelves, the jokes he'd shared with customers, the dreams they'd had of building something together. Can I help you? She asked, her voice polite but distant. Jake touched the rim of his hat. Yes, ma'am, I need some supplies. Coffee, bacon, maybe some of that jerky if you've got it. Margaret moved efficiently around the store, gathering the items he'd requested. Jake watched her carefully, noting the way she held herself with quiet dignity, despite the worry lines around her eyes. She was prettier than he'd expected, with delicate features and an inner strength that showed in the set of her shoulders. You're new in town, she observed, wrapping his purchases in brown paper. Just passing through, Jake replied, though he found himself reluctant to leave. Nice place you've got here? It was my husband's, Margaret said simply. He loved this store, knew every customer by name. The past tense hung between them like a physical presence. Jake had heard about her loss, but seeing the fresh grief in her eyes made it real in a way that barroom gossip couldn't. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and meant it. Margaret's hand stilled on the package. It had been days since anyone had offered condolences without immediately following them with advice about her future. Thank you. That's kind of you, too. Say, their eyes met across the narrow counter, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest. He'd been drifting for months, moving from town to town without purpose, but something about this woman's quiet strength called to him. Mrs. Henderson, he said carefully, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you all right? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Margaret's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. I'm fine, she said quickly, but her voice betrayed her. No, you're not, Jake said gently. And that's okay. Sometimes the world gets too heavy for one person to carry alone. The simple kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. For days, she'd been holding everything. Together, being strong for Lucy, making impossible decisions about their future. To have someone, even a stranger, acknowledge her struggle felt like a gift. I don't even know your name, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Jake Morrison, he replied. And I know you're facing some difficult times. Margaret stiffened slightly. People have been talking. People always talk, Jake said. The question is whether anyone's willing to help. Before Margaret could respond, the store door opened with a sharp bang. Mayor Blackwood entered, his bulk filling the doorway, followed by his son Robert. The mayor's eyes immediately fixed on Jake with the suspicion of a man who didn't like strangers disrupting his plans. Mrs. Henderson, Blackwood said, his voice cold and formal. I trust you're well today? Yes, Mayor Blackwood, Margaret replied. Though her voice had lost its warmth, Blackwood's gaze shifted to Jake, taking in the stranger's weathered clothes and the gun at his hip. I don't believe we've met. I'm Mayor Edmund Blackwood. Jake. Morrison, Jake replied, not offering his hand. "And what brings you to Millbrook, Mr. Morrison?" "Just passing through," Jake said, though something in his tone suggested he might be reconsidering that decision. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I hope you'll find our town hospitable. We take care of our own here, and we don't appreciate outside interference in local matters." The threat was subtle but clear. Jake's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. "I appreciate the warning, Mayor, but I've always found that what's right is right, no matter where you are." The two men stared at each other across the small store, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret watched the exchange with growing. Jake Morrison had never been the kind of man to walk away from trouble, especially when it involved someone who couldn't fight back. After his encounter with Mayor Blackwood, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of riding out of Millbrook the next morning as he'd originally planned, he found himself at the Double R Ranch asking for work. The ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Walt Peterson, looked him up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired dozens of drifters over the years. Jake's horse was well cared for, his gear was quality, and he sat his saddle like a man born to it. More importantly, he met Walt's gaze directly without flinching. "You know cattle?" Walt asked, leaning against the corral fence. "Raised them in Texas," Jake replied. "Worked trail drives from San Antonio to Kansas. No horses, too." Walt nodded slowly. "Pays $30 a month plus meals. Works hard, hours are long, and I don't tolerate drinking or fighting. You got any problems?" "With that? No, sir." "Good, you can start tomorrow. There's a bunk in the main house, and Cookie'll feed you decent. Just don't expect any fancy cooking." Jake shook Walt's hand and settled into ranch life with the ease of a man who'd done it before. But his mind wasn't entirely on the cattle. During his lunch breaks, he found excuses to ride into town, always managing to pass by the general store where Margaret worked. Sometimes he'd stop to buy supplies he didn't really need, just to see how she was holding up. Margaret began to look forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. Jake had a way of making conversation that didn't feel forced, asking about Lucy's schooling or commenting on the weather without the pitying looks she'd grown tired of from other townspeople. There was something solid about him, something that made her feel less alone in her struggles. 3 days into his employment, Jake was repairing fence near the road when he overheard two men talking by the creek. He recognized one as Robert Blackwood, the mayor's son, and the other as a stranger in an expensive suit. "The Henderson property is perfect for what we need," the stranger was saying. "Close to the railroad, good water rights, and once we control it, we can expand operations significantly." "My father's handling the widow," Robert replied. "She be married to him by Sunday, and then the land will be part of our family holdings." "And if she refuses?" Robert's laugh was cold. "She won't. Father's made sure of that. The bank note comes due Monday, and without his protection, she'd lose everything anyway. This way, she at least keeps a roof over her head." Jake's hands tightened on the fence post he was hammering. So it wasn't just about wanting a wife. Blackwood was after Margaret's land. That explained why he was pushing so hard for a quick marriage and why he seemed so confident she'd agree. That evening, Jake rode into town with a head full of plans and a heart full of anger. He found Margaret closing up the store, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Lucy sat on a stool behind the counter, practicing her letters on a piece of slate. "Evening, Mrs. Henderson," Jake said, removing his hat as he entered. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret replied, her face brightening slightly. "I was just about to close up. I can come back tomorrow if you prefer." "No, it's fine." "Lucy, why don't you go wash up for supper?" The little girl looked up from her slate, studying Jake with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you the cowboy Mama talks about?" Margaret's cheeks flushed pink. "Lucy, that's not polite," but Jake smiled. "I suppose I am a cowboy." "Do you like horses?" Lucy nodded eagerly. "Papa promised to teach me to ride, but then he got sick." The sadness in her voice made Jake's chest tight. "Maybe someday I could show you a few things about horses. If your mama says it's okay." "Could you really?" Lucy's eyes lit up with the first genuine happiness Jake had seen from her. "We'll see," Margaret said gently. "Now go wash up." After Lucy left, Margaret busied herself with closing the store, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. "You look like you're carrying the world again," he said quietly, Margaret's hand stilled on the cash box. "Sunday's coming fast." You're supposed to give Blackwood your answer." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake moved closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "What if I told you there might be another way?" Margaret looked up at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Blackwood's not as powerful as he wants everyone to believe. Men like him always have secrets, and secrets can be dangerous things." "You don't understand," Margaret said, shaking her head. "He controls everything in this town. The bank, the businesses, even the sheriff works for him." "Maybe in this town," Jake agreed, "but his reach doesn't extend everywhere. There are people who outrank small-town mayors, people who take a dim view of corruption." Margaret stared at him. "You're talking about going against the mayor. That's dangerous for you, and it won't help me. Even if you could prove something, I still can't pay my debts. What if those debts weren't as legal as they seem?" Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the store door opened and Mayor Blackwood entered. His face darkened when he saw Jake standing close to Margaret, and his hand moved to rest on the gold watch chain across his vest. "Mr. Morrison," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I thought I made it clear that you should be moving on. I found work," Jake replied evenly. "Walt Peterson hired me at the Double R. Did he now?" Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I'll have to have a word with Walt about his hiring practices." "You do that," Jake said, but his tone carried a warning. "Walt's been around these parts a long time. Folks respect him." Blackwood turned to Margaret, dismissing Jake as if he weren't there. "My dear, I hope you're prepared for our conversation. Tomorrow evening, I trust you've made your decision." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "I need until Sunday, as you said." "Of course. But I should mention that I've been reviewing your situation further. The bank is considering calling in your note early, given the uncertainty of your circumstances." The threat was clear. Margaret's face went pale, and Jake felt his temper flare. "That's interesting," he said, stepping forward. "Most banks prefer to work with widows, not force them into desperate situations." Blackwood's face flushed red. "This is not your concern, Morrison." "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But I've known a lot of banks, and I've never seen one that operated the way yours does. Makes a man wonder what other irregularities might be found if someone looked close enough." The two men faced each other across the small store, and Margaret could feel the danger crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Blackwood's hand moved closer to his coat, and Margaret realized with horror that he might be armed. "Gentlemen, please," she said, stepping between them. "There's no need for this." Blackwood straightened his coat and forced a smile. "Of course. My dear, I forgot myself. Mr. Morrison seems to bring out the worst in people." "Or maybe the truth," Jake replied quietly. After Blackwood left, Margaret turned to Jake with tears in her eyes. "You can't keep doing this. He'll hurt you, or worse." "I've dealt with his kind before," Jake said. "They're bullies who fold when someone stands up to them." "Not this time," Margaret said, shaking her head. "This time he has too much to lose. And I have too much to lose if I don't do what he wants." Jake reached out and gently took her hand. "Margaret, what if I told you that I think your husband's debts might not be legitimate? What if Blackwood and his cronies have been manipulating the books?" Margaret's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that men like Blackwood don't usually get rich by being honest. They get rich by taking advantage of people who can't fight back." "Even if that's true, how could we prove it?" Jake's smile was grim. "Leave that to me. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to be strong. For just a little longer." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in months, hope backed by determination. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Jake's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Maybe I don't know you well, but I know enough. I know you're a good mother, a hard worker, and a woman who deserves better than being forced into a marriage she doesn't want. And if you're wrong, if there's no way to stop him?" Jake's expression grew serious. Then I'll find another way. But I won't let him hurt you or Lucy, that's a promise. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something more than gratitude. It was the beginning of trust and maybe something deeper. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Just hold on until Sunday. Don't give him your answer until then. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded, though her heart was pounding. "I'll try." "That's all I ask," Jake said. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her fingers. "You're stronger than you know, Margaret Henderson. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Jake left the store, Margaret watched him walk down the street with purposeful strides. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt like she had an ally, someone who believed in her and was willing to fight for her, but she also knew that the next few days would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine. Mayor Blackwood wasn't the kind of man to give up easily, and Jake Morrison had just made himself a very dangerous enemy. Jake Morrison had spent 3 sleepless nights putting together the pieces of Mayor Blackwood's operation. What he'd discovered was worse than he'd imagined. The mayor hadn't just been pressuring Margaret, he'd been systematically cheating. Half the town for years, working by lamplight in his small bunk at the ranch. Jake had carefully copied information from bank records that Robert Blackwood had carelessly left in the saloon. The young man had been drinking heavily, bragging about his father's clever business dealings to anyone who would listen. Jake had listened very carefully indeed. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Blackwood would identify struggling families, then use his influence at the bank to manipulate their loan terms. Interest rates would mysteriously increase, payment dates would be moved up, and suddenly families who thought they had months to pay found themselves facing immediate foreclosure. But Jake had learned something else during his years as a lawman. Small-town corruption rarely stayed small. Men like Blackwood always got greedy, and greed made them careless. Sure enough, when Jake examined the records more closely, he found evidence of mail fraud, tax evasion, and other federal crimes that would interest authorities far beyond Millbrook. On Friday night, Jake rode hard to the territorial capital, his saddlebags filled with carefully documented evidence. He found Marshal William Hayes at the federal office, a man he'd worked with years ago in Texas. Hayes was honest, competent, and had no love for corrupt officials who abused their power. "Jake Morrison," Hayes said, looking up from his desk with surprise. "I heard you'd given up the badge." "I did," Jake replied, settling into the chair across from Hayes. "But I've found something that might interest you." Hayes listened carefully as Jake laid out the evidence, his weathered face growing more serious with each revelation. The marshal was particularly interested in the mail fraud charges. Blackwood had been intercepting correspondence from the territorial government, altering official documents to benefit his schemes. "This is federal business," Hayes said finally. "If even half of what you found is true, Blackwood's looking at serious prison time." "What I need," Jake said, "is for you to be in Millbrook by Sunday morning. Blackwood's forcing a widow into marriage to cover up his crimes, and she's supposed to give him her answer that day." Hayes nodded grimly. "I'll be there." "But Jake, you know this kind of thing can get dangerous. Cornered animals fight hardest." "I know," Jake replied. "That's why I need official backup." Saturday passed in a blur of tension for everyone in Millbrook. Margaret spent the day trying to act normal for Lucy's sake, but her hands shook as she served customers in the store. She'd promised Jake she would wait until Sunday, but as the hours ticked by, her resolve weakened. Mayor Blackwood, meanwhile, was making his own preparations. He'd arranged for the entire town to gather at the church after Sunday service, where he planned to announce his engagement to Margaret. He'd already had the bands prepared and had pressured the preacher into performing the ceremony immediately. "It's better this way," he told his son Robert as they reviewed the arrangements. "A public announcement makes it harder for her to refuse. And an immediate ceremony prevents any ... complications." Robert nodded nervously. His father's plan seemed foolproof, but something about the stranger, Jake Morrison, worried him. The man had the look of someone who'd seen trouble before and wasn't afraid of it. Sunday morning dawned gray and overcast, with heavy clouds promising rain. Margaret dressed carefully in her best dress, knowing it might be the last time she wore it as a free woman. Lucy sat on the bed, watching her mother with solemn eyes. "Mama, are you going to marry the mayor?" Lucy asked quietly, Margaret's hand stilled on her hair ribbon. She'd been dreading this question. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. But no matter what happens, I want you to remember that I love you more than anything in the world." "I don't want you to marry him," Lucy said, her voice small. "He's not nice like Papa was." Margaret knelt beside her daughter, taking her small hands in hers. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they love, but I promise you, whatever happens, we'll face it together." The church service felt like a funeral to Margaret. She sat in her usual pew, trying to focus on the preacher's words about faith and hope, but all she could think about was the decision waiting for her. Jake sat 3 rows back, his presence both comforting and terrifying. If his plan failed, she knew Blackwood would make him pay after the service. Mayor Blackwood stood up, his voice carrying easily through the small church. "Friends, before we all go our separate ways, I have a joyous announcement to make." Margaret's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading all week. As you all know, our dear Mrs. Henderson has been facing difficult times since her husband's passing. I'm pleased to announce that she has accepted my proposal of marriage, and we will be wed immediately following this announcement. A murmur ran through the congregation, some approving, others uncertain. Margaret started to stand, her mouth opening to speak. When the church door burst open, Marshal Hayes strode in, his badge gleaming on his chest, followed by 2 deputies. Behind them came Jake Morrison, his face set in grim determination. "Edmund Blackwood," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law, "you're under arrest for mail fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." The church erupted in chaos. People jumped to their feet, voices raised in confusion and alarm. Blackwood's face went from confident to furious to terrified in the space of seconds. "This is outrageous," Blackwood shouted. "I'm the mayor of this town. You have no authority here." "I have all the authority I need," Hayes replied calmly, producing a warrant from his coat. "And I have evidence of your crimes, provided by concerned citizens who were tired of watching you abuse your position." Blackwood's eyes found Jake in the crowd, and his face twisted with rage. "This is his doing. He's been stirring up trouble since he arrived?" "Mr. Morrison brought evidence to my attention," Hayes agreed. "Evidence that shows you've been systematically defrauding the people of this town for years." The marshal's deputies moved to arrest Blackwood, but the mayor wasn't finished. "Even if you arrest me, it won't help her," he snarled, pointing at Margaret. "She still owes money she can't pay. The bank will still foreclose." "Actually," Hayes said, consulting his notes, "our investigation shows that most of the debts you've been collecting were illegally inflated or completely fabricated. Mrs. Henderson's original debt to the bank was $47. Not the $400 you claimed?" Margaret felt her knees go weak. $47? "That's right, ma'am. Your husband's medical bills were also inflated by Dr. Reynolds, who was working with Blackwood to create artificial debts. The real amount owed was less than $20. Jake stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned church. "Margaret, you don't owe anyone enough money to lose your home. You never did?" The realization hit her like a physical blow. All the sleepless nights, all the worry, all the agonizing over an impossible choice, it had been based on lies. She'd been manipulated and terrorized by a man who'd preyed on her grief and fear. Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "You can't prove any of this." "It's all circumstantial," Hayes smiled grimly. "We have your son's testimony." Robert decided to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a lighter sentence. Blackwood's face crumpled as he realized his own son had betrayed him. The fight went out of him all at once, and he allowed the deputies to place him in handcuffs without further resistance. As the crowd slowly dispersed, still buzzing with shock and excitement, Margaret found herself standing alone in the church. With Jake, Lucy had run to her Aunt Clara, overwhelmed by the morning's events. "Is it really over?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's over, Jake confirmed. You're free, Margaret. Truly free. The word free seemed to echo in the empty church. Margaret had almost forgotten what it felt like to make choices based on what she wanted rather than what she had to do to survive. I don't know how to thank you, she said, tears streaming down her face. You saved my life, saved Lucy's future. Jake stepped closer, his weathered hands gently wiping away her tears. You don't need to thank me. You would have found a way to survive whatever happened. You're stronger than you know. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something that made her heart race, not pity or duty, but genuine affection and respect. What happens now? Now you get to choose, Jake said simply. You can run the store, work the ranch, do whatever makes you happy. The choice is yours. Margaret thought about all the choices she'd been denied, all the decisions that had been made for her by circumstances beyond her control. Now, for the first time in months, she had the power to decide her own future. What about you? She asked. Will you be moving on now that this is over? Jake's smile was soft and uncertain. That depends. On what? On whether a certain widow might be interested in getting to know a drifting cowboy a little better. Number. Pressure, no demands, just ... stability. Margaret felt a smile tugging at her lips, the first genuine smile she'd worn in months. I think that widow might be very interested indeed,